Melanie, my dear, isn't it time for you to eat something and have a cup of tea? Asked the old woman to the young woman who was curling her hair with rollers. Cosmetics were scattered on the nearby table. I don't have time. I'll feed you later. And I didn't cook anything. If you like, there are some cheese sandwiches over there, replied Melanie. They're stale. I don't want them. But I do want to eat something, said the old woman. Go to your room, for heaven's sake. I'll bring you some tea. Just leave me alone, replied Melanie with anger. The elderly woman sighed heavily and headed to her room, leaning on her worn cane. As Melanie continued her activity, the phone rang. Hello, Ellen? Hi, dear. Happy birthday again, said Melanie. Thanks, Melanie. Can you make it by 6? I'll be waiting for you at the restaurant. Come straight to Olympus, replied Ellen. Yes, I'll call a taxi, said Melanie, still annoyed. Hey, why does your voice sound like that? We're going to have fun. And you're so grumbling like an old woman, asked her friend. Oh, don't remember me talking about old women. My old woman is driving me crazy. I can't take it anymore, Melanie complained to her friend. Listen, she's nobody to you, isn't she? Asked Ellen. Why do you need her? Let her go away. She must have some distant relatives, or send her to a nursing home. She has no one, maybe some distant relatives, but she doesn't know them, and she's never talked to anyone, so she's hanging around my neck. And how can I send her to a nursing home? It's her house, not mine. Charles was stupid, and he didn't think of transferring the house to his name. Now I'd be the owner and wouldn't have to deal with a 90-year-old woman, replied Melanie disappointedly. That's strange, Ellen sighed. She has no daughter or grandson anymore, but she's still alive. Old hag. Hey, is it true she's from a noble family? Yes, Charles told me something like that, but who cares now, replied Melanie. Yeah, you're right, agreed Ellen. But it turns out you're a noblewoman by your husband now, too. It's so funny. You're almost a lady. Melanie laughed loudly. Okay, enough teasing. Tell me better. Did you invite any of the guys? All the peasants will be at your feet, my lady. Just don't be late, or they'll all be taken. Melanie laughed again and said, Don't worry, I won't be late. But I don't want peasants. Choose someone more decent for me. Keep the best one for me. By the way, I can recommend Peter. He's a lawyer who deals with all kinds of transactions and civil cases. He has his own notary company, and he is, so to speak, looking for someone special. Super, Ellen. He's mine. I have no doubt about that, said Ellen, and hung up. An hour later, Melanie left for the city in a taxi, not thinking about Mrs. Goulder, who was lying on her couch in her little room, was quietly crying from the homesickness, loneliness, and hopelessness in which she now lived. 2 weeks passed, and during all this time, Melanie couldn't figure out how to get rid of the annoying old woman and move to the city. She was unable to stand the village where her husband had brought her. Although he loved his grandmother too much, Melanie had other plans. Finally, she came up with an idea and posted an ad for selling the house everywhere. Mrs. Goulder found out about it a few days later. All this time, Melanie cooked delicious lunches and dinners for her, fed her herself, and was generally very caring. And then one day, Melanie started talking about wanting to move to the city. How long can you live in this village? Let me find us a good place to live in the city. There are hospitals nearby, and the conditions are good. What do you need here for? Are you taking me with you? Of course. Where would we be without each other now? Charles was my husband and your grandson. His memory unites us. But, Mrs. Goulder, would you sign a power of attorney for me so I can handle this house as soon as possible and not bother you, okay? Okay. The elderly woman nodded and put her signature where necessary. Homes don't sell quickly, Melanie sighed. Of course we'll have to wait. But she didn't mention that she had already found a buyer and that the deal should be finalized soon. However, the buyer was surprised to hear Melanie's answer when she asked why the house was sold so cheaply. It's simple. Mrs. Goulder is my late husband's grandmother and the only one left from his family. It seems like God has forgotten about her. I want to live in the city and build my personal life. I don't want to drag an old woman with me. And it's good for you too. She hardly ever leaves her room. So if you'll give her some soup, you won't lose the deal. And when she dies, the whole house will be yours. I'm not trying to convince you. You're not the first one to call me, which means I'll sell it for sure. No, I don't mind. I don't mind the old lady living here. It's just kind of unusual. By the way, does she know the terms of the sale? Of course she does. What's your name? Rebecca. All right, Rebecca, let's not get emotional and talk too much. Yes or no? Yes. All right, tomorrow I'll come. We'll sign everything and you can move in. Okay, it's a deal. Early the next morning, Melanie left for the city, telling Mrs. Goulder that she was going on business. And when will you be back? Asked the elderly woman. I don't know. Melanie shrugged her shoulders and left, closing the door tightly behind her. Mrs. Goulder, who had been dozing, was awakened by children's voices well past noon. She opened her eyes and saw a boy about 5 years old before her. Are you our grandmother now? He asked. My name is Alex, and this is my brother Nolan, and our sister Lisa is with our mum. She's little. Not understanding anything, the elderly woman sat up and rubbed her eyes. How can I be your grandmother? Who are you? And how did you get here? We bought you, declared Alex, so you're ours now. At that time, a woman in her 30s appeared in the doorway. She was holding a little sleeping girl in her arms. Hello, my name is Rebecca. Has Melanie told you about me? No, Mrs. Goulder shook her head. Oh, I see. Well, we'll have a long conversation, Rebecca said, turning to her sons. Alex, Nolan, stay in the next room, please. I need to speak with this elderly lady. All right, agreed the boys and ran out of the room. Rebecca then explained who she was and how she had bought the house. The elderly woman listened carefully and shook her head. So, that's how it is. Melanie got rid of the burden and hung it on you. And what about you? Rebecca smiled and replied, We'll live together, if you don't mind, of course. You see, I have nowhere else to go with my kids, and if you send us away, we'll end up on the street. Oh, no, honey, you don't have to go outside. I can see you're being kind. Maybe it's better this way. Strangers are sometimes better than close family. Rebecca stroked the old woman's wrinkled hand and sighed softly. Don't worry, daughter, Mrs. Goulder said finally to Rebecca. I live quietly and don't disturb anyone. I have my own room so you won't hear me, but what I'll ask of you is to prepare food for me. I'll give you my pension for groceries and cooking, too. Do you agree? Agreed. We'll buy food together, and I don't need payment for cooking. It's silly even to suggest that. Don't worry. Everything will be fine. I think so, too. Now, call your boys. I want to meet my so-called grandchildren. Rebecca sighed with relief and smiled. It seemed she would be getting along just fine with this grandmother, and so it turned out. The quiet and modest old lady quickly became dear to Rebecca. They often talked for a long time, with Rebecca telling her about herself, and Mrs. Goulder shared stories of her long and difficult life. I am, after all, a hereditary noblewoman, but our family became poor and my father crossed the ocean to try his luck here. Yes, we didn't get rich here, but we lived well. Now I'm the last one in our line. God gave me only one son, and he also had only one son. Unfortunately, it so happened that my son, his wife, and my grandson Charles all went to the other world, one by one. Charles's wife, Melanie, was pregnant with his child when he passed away. However, when she found out that she was a widow, she got rid of it. I cried and reproached her, but she told me that she did not want to tie herself down with a child. Can you imagine? And so my family line was interrupted. That's fate, Grandma. I gave birth to my own children and never gave up on any of them. But my husband left me. He didn't need us anymore. He's found a new girlfriend. But God judges them, Rebecca said, shaking her head. We'll live without them, won't we, Mrs. Goulder? Of course, my dear. God grant you health and happiness. Your kindness will be repaid, and I will pray for you. I'm sure happiness will find you. Once, Rebecca's eldest son came home with a little girl who was crying, while clutching a torn frill of her dress and a little puppy. What happened? Rebecca asked, surprised by the unexpected guest. Mum, I was playing outside when I saw her running, followed by dogs. I grabbed a stick and went after them, and then she ran to our house. Her name is Kelly, the boy explained. Dear, were you scared? Rebecca asked. Yes, very much, Kelly replied. Where do you live, and where are your parents? Rebecca asked. I live with my dad. His name is Douglas. He's a farmer, and my mum is not here. Dad went out on business. I was playing with Leo, and he ran out onto the street, the girl explained while wiping her tears. And then the dogs attacked him. Leo ran away and I followed him, and the stray dogs followed me, and that's when your Nolan saved me. Rebecca smiled and said, Well done, son. And now, Kelly, let me give you something to change into, and you can go to the kitchen and have lunch. I just made meatballs and pilaf. I'll take care of your dress, so your dad won't scold you. Thank you. Can we feed Leo? Asked Kelly. Of course, replied the woman. 10 minutes later, Rebecca took care of the dress and hurried to the old woman's room. Mrs. Goulder, do you know where Douglas the farmer lives? She asked. Of course I know. He lives on the next street around the corner. He has a red brick house. What happened? The elderly woman asked. Rebecca explained, and Mrs. Goulder shook her head. What a disaster for him and this restless wife. Douglas is a very good man, but his wife Patricia was a loose woman. He loved her madly, but she married him to get back at her city lover. He abused her and left her, but Douglas picked her up. He put up with all her whims, and when she got pregnant and gave birth to his daughter, he was over the moon with happiness. But not for long. Patricia ran away with her ex-boyfriend to the city, leaving her husband and daughter behind. She left a note, and that was it. No shame, no conscience. What a nightmare. Rebecca was horrified, and then she asked, How do you know all this? My dear, we live in a village, and everyone knows everything about each other here. And my grandson's wife, Melanie, was the first gossip. She knew everything. That's how I heard, Mrs. Goulder replied. After that conversation, Rebecca checked on the children in the kitchen, saw that they were calmly having lunch, and hurried outside to find Douglas and tell him that his daughter was safe. She did it just in time, because as soon as she turned the corner, she ran into a man running down the street. Are you Douglas? Rebecca called out to him. Yes. Hello, I'm Rebecca, your neighbour. Kelly is with us. Don't worry, everything is fine with her. Rebecca hurried to reassure him and explained how his daughter ended up in her house. Let's go to our house. I baked a pie. We'll have some tea, and then you can take your daughter home. Thank you, Rebecca. I never leave her alone, but they called me from the office to sign some documents urgently. The neighbour, who sometimes watches her, was not at home, so I thought that if she played in the yard alone for 10 minutes, nothing would happen. And I was wrong. It happens. I have 3 children, so I know how difficult it is to keep an eye on them. So, are we going to have some tea? Do you have a minute? It's a bit inconvenient, Douglas said. Stop it, Rebecca smiled. By the way, my boys seem to have made friends with your daughter, so if you ever need anything, you can bring her to us. I'm a teacher by profession, used to dealing with children, and with my 3, one more or less won't make a difference. Douglas laughed. Well, if that's the case. After becoming friends, Rebecca and Douglas spent a lot of time together and eventually decided to get married. Their strong and friendly family led a happy life that was the envy of the village. Several years passed. Mrs. Goulder became bedridden and Rebecca became her primary caregiver. Rebecca cared for her as if she were her own grandmother, but she could give her nothing but care. Douglas, I'm so worried about Mrs. Goulder, Rebecca said to her husband one day. We've spent so many years together. She's a wonderful old lady, and I cannot imagine how we will live without her. But what could Douglas say to that? He only hugged his wife and held her tightly against him. One day, Mrs. Goulder called Rebecca over and weakly pointed to a chair. I'm dying, my dear, she said, but don't cry. I'm old and tired of living. Thank you for brightening up my old age. I was afraid that Melanie would kill me or put me in a nursing home, and then God sent you. Come on, Grandma. Rebecca tried to comfort Mrs. Goulder. Don't interrupt me. Wait, do you remember when I told you that I was a hereditary noblewoman? It's true, but I have a secret that no one knows about. I wanted to take it to my grave, but I feel grateful to you. You have young children, and Douglas's daughter is counting on you. You need money. In short, I inherited some jewelry from my grandmother. I rarely took anything from there, only when I was really in trouble, and for my son's funeral. There's a floorboard in the basement under the shelves. Lift the 3rd board and you'll see everything. I wish happiness to you, my dear. Rebecca pressed her hand to her mouth and shook her head. Grandma, you could have sold it and been treated at the best hospitals. Mrs. Goulder laughed softly, then sighed. What are you talking about, my daughter? How old am I? No matter what treatment you get, you have to die. My loved ones are waiting for me up there in heaven. I dream about them all night. But you live, sweetheart, and thank you for everything. God gave me peaceful years in the end. Now, please, go and call for Reverend Smith. He promised to come when I needed him. On that same night, Mrs. Goulder passed away. Rebecca and Douglas gave the old woman a worthy funeral, organizing everything properly, and then stood by the fresh grave for a long time, thinking about the strange human fate that brings together and separates completely unfamiliar people on its paths and makes them family. Rebecca didn't immediately decide to tell Douglas about the secret that Mrs. Goulder had entrusted it to her. I don't know if this can be true. She finished her story and looked at her husband. You know, I'm scared for some reason. I would say it's unusual. I never thought I would be lucky enough to see a real treasure with my own eyes. Let's go, let's see. And Mrs. Goulder didn't deceive them. Precious stones in jewelry were shimmering with unreal sparkles in the flashlight's light. What are we going to do now? Rebecca pressed her palm to her lips in panic. Yeah, we'll have to think. Douglas nodded and smiled. Thank you, Grandma. She left a royal gift for us. Who would have thought? Rebecca nodded and hugged her husband, unable to hold back her tears. Meanwhile, Melanie was living in the city in her own apartment, which she bought with the money from the sale of Mrs. Goulder's house. She didn't remember the elderly woman at all and thought only about how to marry Peter. At first, he promised her this often, but lately they had been seeing each other less and less, which couldn't help but worry her. True, he invited her to a restaurant in the evening. Maybe she finally won, and he would propose to her. Another chance for happiness was unlikely to come to her, so you need to hold on to this one with all your might. Melanie approached the mirror and looked at her reflection for a long time, touching the wrinkles around her eyes and the corners of her mouth. Then she took out her best outfit and began to get ready. 2 hours later, she was already sitting at the table, waiting for Peter to say something to her. She lifted the glass to her lips and took a few sips, then put it aside and closely looked at Peter. She couldn't bring herself to start the conversation that was bothering her, and Peter calmly ate his dinner, paying no attention to her. "Peter," she finally couldn't take it anymore, "did you invite me to the restaurant to be silent?" "No, to have dinner. By the way, why aren't you eating anything?" "I don't feel like it." Well, okay. You know, I heard an interesting story today. A few years ago, a woman sold a house along with the old lady who lived there. She deceived the woman, signed some papers, and, so to speak, went to the auction with her house." "And what?" Melanie turned pale. "Nothing. I was just amazed by such an act. I know that many people, when they move, abandon their cats and dogs, not wanting to take them with them, and the pets sit and wait for these traitors for years. But those are pets, and this is a person, alive, sane, and understanding everything. Can you imagine what it would be like to be in that old woman's place? A vile act, isn't it?" "Why are you telling me this?" Melanie asked. "I saw the documents, and I saw your signature." "How could you sink so low, Melanie? And I was going to propose to you." "Peter, Tears welled up in Melanie's eyes. The poor elderly woman turned out to have a secret. She had been keeping a box of jewelry her whole life and gave it to the woman who bought her house and had been taking care of her all this time. You know, a very huge sum came out of it. My friend helped sell the jewelry so that everything was official. Collectors took some things." Melanie's eyes dried up instantly. "It can't be. No, I heard that Mrs. Goulder had something, but I thought it was all a lie. Where is Mrs. Goulder now?" "She's been gone for 6 months. But you can't claim the inheritance. Everything was registered to that woman." "I'll sue. I'll prove it." Melanie flared up. "You're not only angry, but also stupid." Peter stood up and threw the crumpled napkin on the table. "Don't call me again. I'm leaving for the Emirates in a week. I have business there, and I'll also take a break. And this is your ticket." Melanie raised her head and smiled, but Peter slowly tore up the ticket and grinned. "Goodbye, dear." Clasping the scraps of paper in her fingers, Melanie looked at her hands for a long time and tried to calm her trembling. She wanted to take everything from this life, but she lost everything. She left the restaurant with slow steps and went down the dark alley where no one was waiting for